Es un placer para mí, en nombre del Foro Urbano.
It's a pleasure for me to present to you Urban Talk with Mr. Toneria and Brendan Falcon. My name is Jorge Perez Jaramillo. I am a newspaper, administrative newspaper of the City of Medellin. And we have invited tonight Richard Florida to share with us his important ideas on urban, and Mr. Brian, who is in addition a thinker of cities, a friend of Medellin, because he's been an advisor of the city in the past months. I'm going to read parts of their biography. They requested me to be brief. Mr. Richard Florida.
University of Toronto's Rothman School of Management, Global Research Professor at New York University, and the founder of the Creative Plus Group, which works closely with governments and companies worldwide. Florida is the author of several global bestsellers, including the award-winning The Rise of the Creative Class, and is a senior editor of The Atlantic, where he co-founded and serves as editor at large for Atlantic Cities, the world's leading media site devoted to cities and urban affairs. Florida appears regularly on CNN and other news broadcasts and is a regular contributor to the op-ed pages of major newspapers and magazines. Time magazine recognizes Twitter feed as one of the 140 most influential in the world. Florida previously taught at Carnegie Mellon and George Mason University and has been a visiting professor at Harvard and MIT. He earned his bachelor's degree from Rutgers College and his PhD from Columbia University. Thank you, Richard, for being with us.
Thank you, Jorge.
Brent Toderian is a nationally and internationally respected practitioner and leader with over 21 years of experience in advanced urbanism, city planning, and urban design. His establishment of Toderian Urban Works in early 2012 followed 6 years of significant achievement as Vancouver's BC's chief planner from 2006 until 2012, with accomplishments that included 2010 Winter Olympic Games related planning and design, and the Eco-Density and Greenest City initiatives. Brent has been an advisor and collaborator with many global cities from Copenhagen, Oslo, Helsinki, and Rotterdam to Sydney, Medellin, Ottawa, and New York. A passionate practitioner and an advocate for creative, vibrant city building, Brent is the founding president of the Council for Canadian Urbanism, a regular radio columnist on city making with CBC Radio, and a regular writer with the Huffington Post, Atlantic Cities, Planetizing, and Spacing. He's a highly sought-after international speaker, teacher, and collaborator on issues of advanced urbanism. So, my friends, let's talk about these things. We will have a conversation. They want to share a fluid dialogue with all of us, and we would like to start talking about the concept of Cities for Life. Cities for Life has been introduced to the urban agenda during the World Urban Forum 7. How do you understand a city for life? Brent?
Well, I've gotten used to this theme of a city for life in the work I've been doing with Medellin, and I think it's wonderful because it's kind of like how Jan Gehl puts it, designing a city for people. And too long we've been designing cities for cars or designing cities for buildings or objects, but not for the actual people that make a city and truly are a city. And so as I've gotten to know Medellin as a physical city, I've also been getting to know Medellin as a city full of very interesting and passionate and creative people. And so I think it's a perfect slogan. It's a perfect vision for the city. But how to achieve that? It's a very easy slogan to use. How to make it real is the real challenge. And certainly from my perspective as a city builder and as a designer, you can design a city that facilitates a city for life. And as Jorge has heard me say many times over my visits, to me it starts with a city for walkers and bicyclists and transit riders, people who use their feet and their human body to get around, that designs a city that is friendly to the walker. And right now Medellin is not friendly to the walker, but it is improving and can improve, instead of a city for cars. So there's lots of different ways we could discuss a city for life, but maybe the most poignant way I can say is it's the opposite of a city for cars.
It's a city where people make a difference and where neighborhoods matter. And I was saying earlier to the mayor and some colleagues, you know, coming here, and I think you would agree, has been a transformative experience for someone who lives in the United States and Canada and is used to those kinds of cities. Sometimes they're cold. And I think the warmth of the climate, but the warmth of the people, the sense of a city that is for living, not just for working. And in my own research, we've done many, many surveys of what people desire in a city. And of course, people want great safety. They want to be free from violence. They want to have jobs and economic opportunity. They want good infrastructure and transit. But at the very top of the pyramid of their wants is a city that has a wonderful quality of place, that invests in its communities, has abundant green space, green coverage, protects its historic architecture. I call it a quality of place. And when I think of a city of life, I think of a city that puts quality of place foremost, and that creates the real emotional bond of resident and citizen with the city. It makes them a city that they're proud of, a city for life, a city for living, a city that they're attached to, and they want to raise their families and actually attract relatives and friends to come to that city.
And what do you think about that cities are the battleground where the fight for sustainability will be won or lost?
I'm a broken record on this, so bear with me. I think that cities are the grandest of the grand challenges we face in the 21st century. I think we face a climate change challenge that will be won or lost in cities. I think we face a challenge of energy that will be won or lost in cities. I think we face a challenge of innovation. That will be, the battleground will be cities. Resilience. I think we face a challenge of innovation. People are saying that we're stagnating. Cities, as Jane Jacobs taught us, are centers of innovation. And I think one of the things that I really want to communicate to this audience at this incredible forum is that as the UN goes down the road of creating its new goals for sustainable development, that cities and human settlements have to be at the center of those goals. We can... Well, thank you. I think that we can no longer take this non-spatial, non-geographic approach to the world. It is cities, our greatest, human beings' greatest contribution to civilization, that are the core of what we will experience. So we have to elevate cities, location, the spatial factor in all of our goals and put them at front and center of our moving forward on sustainability in the future.
Brent, you did a great job in Vancouver about these things.
Well, Richard and I are both city lovers, and we're passionate about cities. Every city, even the worst city I love, and I'm fascinated by in some way. I have a friend who's literally a brain surgeon, and we have a discussion and a debate about what's harder, figuring out the brain, the human brain, or figuring out cities. And I insist it's cities, and naturally he insists it's the brain. But both are probably our greatest challenges as human beings. But I found your question fascinating because Richard was talking earlier today about the new scale of thinking, the mega region. And we can all agree that cities are our greatest challenge, but also our greatest success and our greatest opportunity. The solutions will be found in cities, and cities indeed are the solution to many of our challenges. But the truth is there are challenges at the city region scale that are staggering. And I often say a different line. I don't say the success or failure, where's the line? The success or failure will be, the fight for sustainability will be won or lost in cities. I often say that the fight for sustainability will be won or lost in the suburbs. And this is probably a little less of an issue for Latin America, but in North America and Australia and New Zealand and increasingly parts of Europe and other parts of the world, the massive amounts of growth going into car-oriented suburbs is actually the battleground for our sustainability, because we can do our urban cities almost perfectly, but if most of the growth is going to that suburban edge development and it's being designed around the car, then our cities won't save us from the damage done by our suburbs.
Which city do you think represents those ideas the best?
Well, people always ask that, and I think that it may be the wrong question in this way. I think that certain cities do certain things well, and the real task of this great forum and this great gathering is to learn from one another. I mean, New York City, where I lived part of the time, has created a massive urban agglomeration of 22 million people that works with transit and subways. But it's struggled to find a city for living. It doesn't have the access to the natural environment, and now it's cleaning its waterfronts that Medellin has. It probably hasn't activated the neighborhoods. One great takeaway from here was activating the neighborhoods to deal with problems of poverty. Many Western cities focus on the areas of concentrated advantage and prosperity. San Francisco has incubated phenomenal technology, but it's caused a great economic divide. Well, I think our real task is to find the individual things, or the sets of things. Vancouver have showed us how to be livable, where Brent is from. Toronto has shown us how not to elect a mayor, but that's another question. I had to get that in. But I think that one of the great things we can do in forums like this is learn from the good things and the great things that individual cities do and build up a knowledge base that we can share that learning, disseminate that learning, and build better cities across the world.
I think there are cities that I think do many things well, and they are my favorite cities. New York doesn't have to think about whether it's the most livable city in the world or the most creative city in the world. It's just a great city, and it does many things well. Similarly, cities like Copenhagen and Stockholm and Barcelona and others, they don't try to do just one thing the best in the world. They are complete cities. They are successful in so many different ways. As compared to my city, which is one of the most livable cities in the world, and now has a goal of becoming the greenest city in the world. I'm working with Auckland, New Zealand. They want to become the most livable city in the world. I say there's a maturity point in cities where you stop wanting to be the best at one thing, and you realize cities are very complex things that should be doing many things well, and you don't need to focus on just one thing. So I love those cities that just amaze you with their successes and their challenges, because they're complex, they're messy, and they're a constant work in progress. There's no such thing as a perfect city. But I love the cities that are striving constantly to be better. No matter how much you achieve, you always want to do more. You're never satisfied.
And one of the things we've been talking about today, especially Brent and I coming from northern cities, Vancouver, myself, Toronto, and New York, I live occasionally a little bit in Miami, the idea that in the north there are many great plans or many great visions or many great theories. And I think one of the most remarkable things about this forum here is how much cities in the south have to teach cities in the north, not vice versa. And particularly with the focus on the neighborhood, revitalizing neighborhoods, the organic, up from the bottom way, residents and nonprofits and community organizations. We've had numerous conversations across the course of this forum about how important it is to learn from that and to empower residents in neighborhoods in quote-unquote more advanced northern cities. So I think it's a two-way street, and in particular there is so much we can learn from Medellin and other cities about how citizens and nonprofits, governments and neighborhoods can solve problems on their own.
When Jorge first contacted me to come here, I said, really? You want to learn from Vancouver? I want to learn from Medellin.
I think that's really important.
The best cities are the ones that want to learn and are open-minded to learn from every other city. And I think Medellin deserves an increasing... This WWOOF is going to put Medellin on the world map. Because it's such an innovative and creative and open-minded city, one of your character traits for a city. Because no matter what you've achieved, the mayor said it wonderfully yesterday, where he said, if we win an award for the most innovative city, the next day we want to do something even more innovative. And that attitude is the way that you're going to continuously improve.
You said it. I think we look at cities as containers of innovation, of economic opportunity, of solutions. But in a world that's so riven by violence, where there's so much conflict and tribalism, cities are the place people from various backgrounds, rural and urban, different ethnicities, domestics and locals and migrants, they are the centers of open-mindedness and of tolerance in a world that sometimes you get very worried about. And one of the most remarkable things that Medellin has pioneered, but you see happening across the world, is this remarkable downswing in violence in cities. Cities across the world that were violent a generation ago are becoming safer because they're becoming places where neighborhoods work, where people feel safe, where streets are activated. So I think cities are economic units, but they're also so important to our culture and our civilization and our open-mindedness and tolerance of one another.
Okay, let's talk about segregation and inequity. One thing you were expressing us during the lunchtime. Rampant inequity tends to be the social cost of unmanaged urbanization. How can cities be physically transformed to reduce inequity? And how do these spatial changes result in improved social outcomes?
Well, we're so fortunate to have this forum focused on the issue of equity. There are two definitions of the word equity. The first definition of the word equity is to create value. Create equity in your home, create equity in your neighborhood, to create equity in your corporation. And the second definition of the word equity is to make sure all can share in that. And that's what we have to do. We have to grow value, grow our economies, create opportunity, but make sure everyone is included. We need a model of inclusive growth. But here's the problem. For years we thought that technology drives economic growth, that accumulation of knowledge drives economic growth. This thing called human capital drives economic growth. But ever since the work of Jane Jacobs, we learned that it's actually the clustering of human beings in cities that makes technologies, accumulates knowledge, creates more educated populations. This same clustering of people, the jamming together of people in cities in density, this sorting, geographic sorting, also divides us. As the advantage concentrate, as the innovators concentrate, as the knowledge workers concentrate, we create not only an inequality. See, this is our challenge. Inequality is part of the problem, but the spatial segmentation of our cities is far worse. The fact that we have areas of concentrated prosperity, the likes of which we've never seen, next to areas of concentrated disadvantage. This is the grand challenge of the modern city. And my view is we have to create pathways to opportunity. We have to first uplift jobs. We have to make sure the jobs for the lowest are tapping creativity. We have to connect through infrastructures to make sure people can traverse the city and get to areas of opportunity. And we have to build more affordable housing. And that means more than just high-rise towers. A friend of mine said, many economists believe that building more high-rise towers will solve our problems. A friend of mine said that when you talk about the rents rising, it's not that high-rise towers will reduce the rents. The high-rise towers are a product of the rising rents in the first place. We need a massive commitment to creating dense cities at appropriate scale with affordable housing for all. And this, if we don't address this challenge of inequity and spatial segmentation, it could derail. That challenge could derail so many of the important things of making the engine of urbanization work. I think of all of our challenges, including climate and energy, that one has to be front, and that's why I'm so happy to be here with all of you. That has to be front and center of the agenda of all of our world's leaders moving forward.
Well, I have to say, once again, I'm sorry to do this, but I'm going to question a little bit the nature of the question. Rampant inequality tends to be the social cost of unmanaged urbanization. Think about that for a minute. I've seen many examples of managed urbanization that leads to inequity. Often, inequity is a result of our managed urbanization. We are making deliberate decisions in our planning to segregate, to protect rich people from poor people. And because of gentrification, to protect poor people from rich people or middle-class people. So to suggest it's a result of unmanaged urbanization is probably ignoring the fact that a lot of our planning is actually creating or at least exacerbating this problem.
And to build on that, it is true, though, that inequality in the past was a product of class division, the kind of thing Marx wrote about. now it seems to have, it's not just a product of faceless technology or faceless knowledge or a class war. It is very much built into the very economic engine itself. So thinking about the ways to construct pathways that overcome, and the other thing that's so important, you know, I hear this in this forum. We seem to be dividing in this world of urbanism into a group of urban optimists, and maybe I'm part of that, maybe I'm guilty of that. People who believe that urbanization will just conquer all of these problems somehow magically. If mayors ruled the world, we would all be great. If cities had power, it would all be solved. And on the other hand, there's the urban pessimists. You know, gentrification is ruining the cities in the north. Our great global cities in the south are filled with slums that are quote-unquote persistent. And I think one of the things that we have to learn is that the logic of the economy is on our side. The logic of the economy is saying that the clustering of people, urbanization, is a force for change, but we have to manage it. We have to build a social compact and a set of institutions that make sure those pathways for development and economic opportunity are open to more. We can't afford to live in a more divisive and divided and segregated society.
Well, but there's a third category. I'm neither an urban optimist or an urban pessimist. I'm an urban pragmatist. And so I can both be complimentary when it's warranted and concerned when it's warranted. And this issue of, this is why Medellin is such a perfect city to have a conversation about equity. Because I'm sure we're going to talk about lots of aspects of equity, food access, education, childcare, social services, etc. There are many aspects that go beyond the physical design of the city, but I think Medellin has been an example of those soft issues, those soft innovations, which Medellin has been so fantastic at, but also the hard things, the physical things. You recognize that transportation is a critical form of equity. It connects the city. It provides access to everyone, to the entire city. And it's such a brilliant way of looking at transportation. And I tell you, the vast majority of the world does not look at transportation that way. They don't look at transportation as equity. And yet, it still costs $1, I understand, an American dollar, which is 1,000 Colombian pesos, I think, to take the transit. So that still leaves $2. So that still leaves a lot of people choosing between taking transit and buying food. So this is why I stress walking. Which is the most equitable form of getting around the city, and biking and cycling, which again is just, to me, an extension of walking, because there is nothing more equitable than being able to walk around your city and get to where you need. But that starts with land use. It starts with building things nearby, rather than having to go far distances. And it has to address, in Medellin's case, this perception, this perception of safety and violence, because so many people have said to me, Brent, we don't walk in Medellin because it's not safe, because we're fearful. And so they use the car as armor to protect them from the city, as if you need to be protected from your own city. But in your best moments, since 1990, since you've had this combination of what I call determined and desperation, you've taken back your city. You've taken back your public spaces in these amazing scenarios like the Yuva, which the mayor showed us today, just a staggering opportunity of embracing your city. This is not a city that's afraid of itself. This is not a citizenry that is afraid of its public spaces. This is a city that has taken back its public spaces. But now you have to take back the streets and see the streets as places to walk and to get around your city, and not use the car as protection. That will get you to a real city for life and a real city of equity, because there's nothing more equitable than walking.
I want to build on that. When we think about, if we call it the urban challenge we face, or some might even say the urban crisis, when I look at that, it's a challenge of public goods. That what happened during the industrial era in the south and in the north, in Medellin, in Barcelona, in New York, is that we moved to a model where the car and a privatized way of life was hegemonic. And people could protect themselves, seal themselves off from their city. And we systematically disinvested in many of the cities of the world on key public goods like transit. Why do you think we're seeing gentrification in places like New York and San Francisco? Because there's so little access to the public good of transit. More affluent people are colonizing it. We refuse to build the kinds of green space that would provide a portal for democracy, for interaction. Now our challenge is these very limited public goods that we made disinvestment and insufficient investment are so highly sought after that we need to think of our cities as places that reinvest in these public goods. Transit is critical, because transit is critical in these two dimensions of equity. And the first dimension, as our friends from the Santa Fe Institute, I see Jose Lobo and Luis Betancourt are here this evening, taught us great cities grow because they increase their metabolism. They were different than any other species, a cat, a mouse, a dog. As other species get bigger, they get slower. As cities get bigger, we get faster. What makes cities get faster in the circulation and metabolism of goods and ideas and people is transit connectivity. If you can't move, if you're so congested, your metabolism slows down and you fail. But transit is also important for the other side of equity, just as Brent said. It's a way of connecting citizens to opportunity in a way that they don't have to make this bankrupting, in many cases, bankrupting investment in a private vehicle. And thirdly, it creates a more democratic city, as we know, because when you're in public space, when you're on transit, you have to share the city with others who are dissimilar or unlike you. So I think transit really is, and public space, key investments that create a better, more thriving, more democratic and equitable city.
So let's talk about the alternative then. The alternative is what we've been building for decades, which is the city designed around the car. And one of the best messages we have in Vancouver is that by deprioritizing the car, not balancing, we don't use that word, by prioritizing walking and biking and transit above the car, we've actually made mobility work better for everyone, including drivers. And that's the most important fact. This is not a war on the car. This is an argument for cities, because cities function better and everybody gets around better when you prioritize walking, biking, and transit. We've got the data to prove that. It's even easier to drive in Vancouver than it used to be. And it's much easier for walking, biking, and taking transit. So that's the counterintuitive thing. When you design for the car, it fails for everyone, including drivers. When you design multimodally, it works better for everyone, including drivers. Now, you are an incredibly important moment right now in Medellin. You have only 14% of the population of your city as vehicle owners, car owners. I'm not sure if that includes motorcycles, there are many motorcycles in this city. Yeah. That's very low by comparison to many other parts of the world, but it's going up. And every time I talk about this, I hear that people in Medellin see car ownership as a measurement of success, of quality of life, of status, at the same time as the rest of the world is increasingly rejecting that notion. Richard has the data better than I do, but the point is that the rich countries and the rich demographics are rejecting this notion of car ownership, certainly as a status symbol. And then the millennials, the younger generation, you know, your smartphone is more of a status symbol than a car. So the two largest demographics in human history, the millennials and their parents, the boomers, who are now being called the broken hipsters, I love this phrase, are predisposed towards urban conditions and are moving away from car-oriented urbanism. So I say we as urbanists have no excuse anymore. We've got better data than we've ever had in human history about the science of cities, and we've got the two largest demographic groups in human history predisposed towards what we're talking about. So we better do good things with this scenario.
And so 2 points to quickly build on that. One is one of the great dysfunctions of the industrial age that actually Marx wrote about and other great classical economists wrote about was this terrible separation of home from work. And so we built a society partly, ultimately dependent on the car, where people lived incredibly far, and in some cities commutes of 1, 2, in Asian cities, 3 hours per day are considered reasonable as people move further and further outside the core to find affordable housing. Now, of course, as Brent was saying, the most affluent people in the most affluent societies, not just the United States and Canada, but the really affluent societies, Northern European societies, Scandinavian and Nordic societies, are saying to hell with that model. We don't need to pile up material goods. We want to live closer to work. We want a higher quality of life. We want to walk or cycle because physically it's better for us to be active. So the question this raises is not just the Medellin versus New York or Vancouver or Toronto. We're going to build more cities in the next 50 to 100 years than we have throughout all of human history. We're going to put how many billion, you know, we can mess with the numbers, 3 more billion, 4 more billion, 5 more billion people in cities. We are going to spend hundreds of trillions of dollars, build hundreds of a scope unheard of. How are we going to do it? Are we going to do it built on the old model of a privatized city with a gross dysfunctional separation of home from work, with plans imposed from above? It's charted in the skeleton, the infrastructure of the city. Or are we going to do it in a different way, which is partly bottom-up, with a vision from the top? Is it going to be one that makes work and home become closer, and which is much more functional from a perspective of energy, climate, and by forcing people to rub shoulders, interact, increasing densities, having people have smaller space perhaps, creating a more of an innovative dynamic. And I think that challenge is equivalent to the 14% car ownership in Medellin on a global scale. And we are at that tipping point today. We can't wait any longer.
And the beauty of the data that we have, because of people like Richard, who have provided more evidence for us that our instinctual feelings about how cities work are right. The beauty of that is we can have this conversation that is non-ideological. Because for years we were getting killed by an ideological discussion about what city we like better. Raise your hand here if you love bikes. Great, you're not helping.
You asked the question.
I know. But my point is, it's not about loving bikes. And we often make it about that, which makes it an ideological discussion about what do I like better, bikes or cars. What we can prove is that if you design a city for cars, it just doesn't fit. It's a laws of physics kind of thing. If 100% of Medellins want to drive, nobody moves anywhere. That's an actual definition of equity. Rich or poor, you're not moving at all. That's equal. But that's not the kind of equity we want. So, but we can prove that because it takes so much less space and money and environmental impact, etc., to move people a kilometer or a mile by walking, biking, or taking transit, cities function better. So I love my bike. I gave up my car 5 years ago, but I'm very careful to keep it from being an ideological discussion, because I'm a city lover. I'm not a bike lover. I'm a city lover, not a transit lover. And it's not about having a preference for these things. It's about pulling back from that and having a discussion about successful cities or failed cities. And in all those cities that are going to be built, that's what it's about. The ones designed around the car are going to fail because it just doesn't fit.
And Brent, you're right. If I look at our field, I think the trend is turning, but our field has been filled with normative arguments and advocacy arguments for all the good reasons, is that people wanted to do the right thing and cared so much about social justice and so many important things, but it still has this very normative ideological underpinning. But in fact, we suffer for something worse. I call it the narcissism of small differences. In urban affairs, more than any other field, we are battling over points that in a bigger picture we all agree on. So forging this broad consensus is part of it. But we do have ideological enemies. I see it every day in my life in Toronto. You want to come look at it? Come to my city. Look at what an anti-urban mayor can do to damage a city. There are forces of reaction. They are very real out there. They don't care about our debates. In fact, they would encourage our debates, our narcissism of small differences, because they don't want cities to succeed. Because they see cities as places as different people get together. These places that create new ideas, that overthrow the established order. So we need to get our act together. And it goes back to something Brent said. I was talking to Mary Rowe, an old friend of mine, and who knew, I got to know Jane Jacobson later in life, but Mary knew Jane Jacobs better than me. And Jane Jacobs, arguably the greatest urbanist we've ever had. And she said Jane had no ideological banners. She had no normative predispositions. She observed cities and cared about pragmatic solutions.
Exactly.
And this has to be our start point. We have to be able to observe what works and what doesn't. We have to achieve a goal of what is a better city, a more equitable city, a more efficient city, a more resilient city. And we need the data and the science to show us the pathway. Without that, we have opinioneering and normative arguments. So this challenge of getting away from all of the things that may have motivated us as urbanists, good motivations, and getting on with the pragmatics and understanding what works and what doesn't, I think this is a huge challenge ahead of us. And that's why I think this forum, everyone I've talked to said, they could see a tipping point here in this forum. They could feel a tipping point occurring as we realize that we have to enhance the function of cities, the function of urban areas, and we need new, more pragmatic approaches to do it.
Let's say that you expect to have...
I started that point, but I want to give a proviso, because I'm also nervous about too much of a focus on the science of cities, because cities are both an art and a science. And one of the lines I often use is, there's so many things that I can't prove through data that I know is right. The value of beauty, for example, as someone said earlier, the conversation about truth and trust and beauty and such, these are things you can't quantify. And that's just as important. So we need to find this balance point between science and art, because not everything that counts can be counted.
Even the greatest scientist will tell you that intuition is the most important thing, that intuiting new solutions, culling from a basis of expertise, but data can show you when your intuition is wrong. And so in that sense, we need great intuitions, great art, but we also need, look, we have virtually nothing. We are starting in ground zero. Nation states have national income accounts. They can track their economies. They can track their industrial and occupational structures. We can barely do it across 2 developed countries. So creating data which enables us to understand what is working for the economy, where incomes are rising, how the environment is being affected, it's just something the World Bank and other international organizations that we just have to put our heads around and do. If not, we're talking past one another. So it's not the whole answer, but it's a component of the answer.
That's why we love cities. They're so complex.
Just to tell you that there were a new, 1 week ago here, we will have 43,000 new cars in our streets this year. So let's talk, we're coming from equity into livable cities. What livable city do mean?
Not that.
Not that, yeah.
Because again, it's not about an ideology. It's what you have to do to make those cars move. And once you have more cars, there's an incredible political pressure to allow them to move. And the line is, oh, well, let's build more roads. And the question is, what are you going to tear down in order to create more physical space for that car capacity? Now, we know in Vancouver, because we never built the freeways, and it's an easier city to drive in. If you have to really wrap your mind around that. If you really want people to drive better, more cars, well, not more cars, there's no way to handle that. But if you want people to drive better, then build more transit and build more walking and biking, and it'll be easier to drive. It's hard to make progress on a livable city. It truly is, and I'm sorry to keep harping on cars. But it's very hard to make progress if we're still adding more cars and trying to build space, parking space and moving space for them. Auckland, New Zealand, where I'm an advisor for both the city and Auckland Transport, wants to have their cake and eat it too. They want to make transit better. They want to make walking and biking transit better. But they also want to build more road space for cars. And I keep telling them that if they really seriously want to be the most livable city in the world, which is their official goal, they're not going to get there this way. They fundamentally have to change course.
So when I think of livability, I think it's a core value. In economic and social value. When I think about the way we thought of economic growth and development in the industrial age, we measured that by measuring material output, economic output. How much economic output you produce per person, the basic metric of productivity. But what the smartest social scientists, economists, political leaders are telling us, what citizens are telling us in surveys not just of the rich countries but of the poor countries, is there something more than material well-being. It's called happiness, or what psychologists and behavioral economists call well-being, subjective well-being. When we ask people what adds to their subjective well-being, of course, having a great and supportive family life is absolutely critical. Having a job that provides income and is something, hopefully, that gives your life meaning and purpose if you're in a more advanced profession. But being in a livable city, being in a neighborhood that thrives, that has open space and green space and tree canopy and walkability, this is the third component of socioeconomic well-being that most people discount. They understand the family life, they understand the economic career part, but cities are just the place you happen to live or the place you happen to work. And these surveys show us so clearly that being in a livable city with this quality of place that I mentioned before is this third bucket of happiness. And it doesn't matter, rich or poor. Whatever kind of person you are, that quality of place matters so much. And then we were talking about it. You know, I happen to like cars. I don't drive very much, but I have a car, and I think they're kind of cool. I grew up when cars were cool, and performance cars. But I think we can't build a city for cars because they're wasteful, but they're also very dangerous. You know, empowering the car, if I think about it, it's a #1 killer of many age groups, particularly of young people who are hit by cars or get in car accidents. But it's also debilitating to our health. You know, sitting in a car is very debilitating, heart disease and diabetes. And then finally, if you look at these studies of socioeconomic well-being, across the board, they find one factor most detrimental to having a happy life. And it's not, being in bad health is awful, but it's not being in a bad marriage, it's not having a boss you don't like, it's having a long and arduous commute. Having a long and arduous commute is the #1 factor that deteriorates most people. And we just take it as something that we believe, well, if you want to live and have a house that you think is affordable, you live far away and you commute to work. But it is the #1 factor. So I think for all those reasons, livability is so critical, not only to building a city, but to making sure that people have meaning and purpose and happiness in their own lives.
I've had the opportunity, either as a planner for the city or as a consultant, to have a relationship with 6 out of the 10 most livable cities in the world, according to the Economist magazine, at least, if you believe them. And I'm finding the discussion about how to enhance livability in these cities is fascinating. Always it's about mobility. But pulling away from that, it's about, you know, this idea of quality of place. It's really about the quality of relationships. And it's about how the relationship you have with your city. The same studies that Richard has been citing, it's about how many relationships you have, extracurricular activities, things that have been eroded in North American culture because of the distance between things. And that has eroded this perception. Putnam's work about bowling alone. And if you should read my friend Charles Montgomery's book, Happy City, which goes into the science of this quite extensively. Happiness, you know, we often use it interchangeably with quality of life or livability. It's not necessarily the same thing. I can say Vancouver is one of the most livable cities in the world. I'm not sure I would say it's one of the happiest cities in the world. We're actually grumpy a lot of the time, maybe because it rains so much. But
long commutes.
But it is about those the city of embracing this kind of thing. I strongly believe that this kind of approach is going to dramatically increase Medellin's quality of life, livability, happiness, all at the same time, because it's the quality of the civitas, the civic life, the relationships with your neighbors and your community and your friends, and how far it is they are away from you. We talk about social media and technology replacing personal. It never happened. It's never happened. If anything, social media just reinforces the importance of personal human relationships. So livable cities are cities that facilitate human relationships. Mobility and cars are part of that, but it's not the only thing. It's about providing spaces for public life.
And I think you mentioned one of them. And when we look at livability or happiness, subjective well-being, community satisfaction, loving the place, being emotionally attached, we find 3 factors that really matter. The first one is exactly as Brent said, and Robert Putnam. It's the kind of social engagement and the density of the social engagement you find, the ability to connect with people, make meaningful friends, and especially in a hypermobile world. You know, I'm reminded of Jane Jacobs' quote that she always said, new ideas require old buildings, but what we're finding is new people in a city often more require old buildings and old neighborhoods because it gives them that texture and that density that they feel connected. But there are 2 other factors. The more diverse a city is, the more ethnically and culturally and socioeconomically diverse a city is, and the more tolerant and open-minded it is to those groups, the more overall happiness goes up. So it's not just having social engagements among yourself, it's seeing that others are valued. The gay community, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, poor people, rich people, entrepreneurs. But the third factor is the one that we always battle against, and I battle against personally. Many urbanists of the old school will say what matters is a good job, a safe street, and good infrastructure. Those are all very important. You're not going to go anywhere without them. But what we find really matters to this quality of place and happiness is the aesthetic beauty. Painting those buildings on the hillside matters. Having green tree canopy in a lower income neighborhood matters. Having open space available in every neighborhood. Having community theater groups and community arts organizations. These aren't the frivolous things that yuppies benefit from alone that we hear. These are things that every community benefits from. And when you have dense social engagements, open-minded diversity, and tolerant treatment, and this kind of focus on the aesthetic, quality of place, that's where we see truly thriving and engaged and livable communities.
I'm really glad that Richard and I agree on this, because those of you who follow me on Twitter might have seen that I had a Twitter debate, which I try to avoid doing, by the way, with a very good friend of mine and a transit urbanist I very much respect. And he works a lot in the United States. And I won't say who it is because I don't want to embarrass him, but he's given up on quality. The nature of our debate was, I don't need, he said, a beautiful walk. And I didn't say a beautiful walk, I said an inviting walk. Jan Gehl speaks about inviting people to walk and to bike and to take transit. And I agree with that. His line was, I work in America, it's good enough that it's just there. Because there are so many places that there isn't even a sidewalk. So just putting a sidewalk in maybe is good enough. We were agreeing more than disagreeing, but it's the bar that we set for ourselves. It's what's good enough. And this line, good is the enemy of great, because good becomes good enough. I think that the cities that I work with are ambitious cities, and Medellin is one of them. You don't want to just do good. I think you're always striving for something above that. And that's one of the qualities of a city that is well positioned, not just for success, but greatness, by saying good is not good enough. And embracing the idea, the old architects, if there are architects in the room, was it Vitruvius? Firmness, commodity, and delight. Those were the aspects of architecture and design. It had to stand up and not fall down. It had to serve its purpose, which is commodity, and delight was the beauty. Delight was the heart, the love. And we have to build places that are lovable. And I used to, before I was chief planner in Vancouver, I used to worry about losing my credibility if I used words like beauty, because that's wishy-washy. And then I became chief planner, and I said, wait a minute, now I'm chief planner. I determine what is cool or not in my city, and legitimate or not. So if the chief planner is speaking about beauty, then beauty matters. So it's important for us to be speaking about things like
And I had a conversion experience. Remember, I was the guy who was the traditional American, coming from a very working class part of New Jersey, a father who's a factory worker. I really believed that was all about creating jobs and work and just luring the company to make the jobs. And when I grew up as an urbanist, that was the idea of a city. A city was a container for work. You had trains or highways or industrial parks or factory centers so that people could work. And if you had a job, that was the definition of a good life. And of course, in the American dream, that good job got you a car and your own private home. Well, it's an empty life. And just questing after material things can leave people tremendously empty. What I had to look at is a city where people wanted to be. Because, in fact, the city is, as we said at the outset, a city of people. And if people don't want to be there, they will leave and go to another city. And a city had to be not only a city of work, but a city of quality. And I looked at this from the data. It wasn't just something that was an opinion. That, in fact, cities that were more livable, that had better transit, that had an emphasis on biking and pedestrian, that cared about open space, that invested in historic structures, not knocked them down, that gave people these options, they had better economies. So we're up against this incredibly ingrained mentality. I'll bet not everyone in the room is convinced that really what cities are about are, fast infrastructure, fast points of connection, and creating jobs. And that's very important. But it's about a lot more of that. And as we grow cities, giving people purpose and meaning and life, a city of life, that becomes the things that in our newer economies we can strive for.
The mayor's going to be very happy he gave me these pictures, because I'm certainly promoting the work that Medellin has done. So again, this is this UVA exercise, and it really reinforces this point, because these are water tanks. If you're from somewhere else and you haven't heard about this, you have to hear about it. This is water tanks, and they weren't useless water tanks that you are debating whether you're going to tear down or reuse. They serve a function. They provide water for the city, the entire city. They happen to be distributed pretty evenly around the entire city. The point of the design exercise is things can be good and important at more than one thing. They can serve more than one purpose. So all they did was take out the fences that were keeping people away from these, and doing obviously some more things, but inviting the people in, and then activating that thing which is still a water tank. It's still providing that function. So it's got firmness, commodity, and delight. But now it's a piece of public art, and now it's a community gathering place.
And the same is going to be done in the river with the parks.
Exactly. This idea that we have to get away from thinking that things have one purpose. We're always trying to solve more than one problem in design, but in city building, nothing can have just one purpose. This old mindset called the civic art movement at the beginning of the 19th century, it was the idea that everything that was functional should also be beautiful. It was a simple concept that the modernists destroyed. And now we're sort of finding our way back to that, and I think that's wonderful for cities.
But this stuff has an economic purpose. The industrial age busted people apart. It highly specialized work. It created cities where home and work were separated because the industrial engine worked that way, on a fine-grained division of labor. And people were doing our cities were dumb, and workers were doing dumb tasks, screwing things together, putting bolts together, putting cars together. The new city requires, and the new economy requires, engaged people. The best companies are the ones, from manufacturing to agriculture to service to knowledge, that engage their workers, that they work together in teams to innovate on the factory floor, in the R&D center, creating new mechanisms of engagement. What are cities? What are cities' economies? Places that people meet and interact and combine and recombine in new ways to discover new things. These are economic engines. They're not just parts of a livable, frivolous, better way of life. By having public spaces, by encouraging interaction, by engaging citizens to solve problems, by causing these serendipitous interactions, the city is increasing its innovation, its metabolism. So they're very much rooted in the new kind of urban, talent-based, human-based economy that we're building. And that's not just something in the advanced world. That is something that's across the world that creates robustness and resilience and economic success.
One of the messages that I constantly reinforce is good design creates value. And often design and beauty is seen as an aesthetic, a nice to have if you can afford it, a frivolous thing. And I like to joke that, and it's not really a joke, that the idea that design is frivolous was disproven by Steve Jobs and the Germans. Because from a business perspective, Apple showed that good design creates value, and there's nobody more pragmatic than the Germans. And they have invested amazing amounts in high-quality, beautiful design because they get that it leads to success. So we have to I just did a talk in Sydney, Australia for the Lord Mayor on making this point about the connection between design and private sector value creation and public sector value creation. We've got to get away from this idea that it's a frivolous. It's a value creator. It's an economic engine. It creates more success at the same time, economic success, at the same time as every other type of success, from livability to sustainability, etc.
I would like to hear you talking about the city with a shared vision by the community, a citizens project. That's what Medellin has tried to do.
Well, you know, I didn't start as an urbanist. I started as a student of factories and high-performance economic organizations. And I watched my country, the United States, experience deindustrialization. I watched the factory where my dad worked, an eyeglass factory, decline and shutter and throw thousands of people out of work. Why? Because they didn't engage the workers. They thought the worker was a hand and arm, but not a brain. And then I went to visit Japanese companies like Toyota. And why did they succeed? Because they engaged the shop floor worker. And I went to this factory on the footsteps of Nagoya, Japan, and I was asking where this new technology in that factory was invented. And the plant manager said, "You have it backward. This was invented by our factory workers on the factory floor." They are the source of innovation and ideas. And my dad told me this in his factory. He always said it's the knowledge, the creativity of the simple men who work here which make our factory great. We drove that out with technology and assembly lines. The same thing goes with citizen engagement. It can't be top-down. It can't be seeing citizens as an afterthought with just a public hearing. The citizens themselves are the source of the vibrancy, of the energy, but of the economic, having that processing power, you know, that decentralized processing power of thousands upon thousands, millions of citizens in thousands of neighborhoods. That's why the neighborhood is such a critical unit. We talk about cities, but cities are really federations of great neighborhoods. And when citizens take control, and they can solve these problems. We were talking with Luis and Jose today that have a new project on slums with Slum Dwellers International, empowering neighborhoods in slums to create data and take the pulse of their neighborhood and look at what's working and share that with cities. That's exactly what the best companies did. They gave the workers the ability to look at data and make themselves better, and they led to a productivity revolution. I think it's the same, except that we don't think of cities that way. We don't think of citizen engagement. We think of that as maybe a public issue. It's actually the way to make a stronger, more vibrant, more resilient, and more economically thriving city.
Well, as a practitioner, I've been in rooms almost as filled as this one with angry people who want to participate in the heat, and I have the scars to prove my participation in many of those kinds of discussions. One of the things I'm doing with Medellin is providing some perspective and advice on public engagement, because Vancouver is often held up as an example, a global example of doing engagement right, because we've been building this city, but we've been building it with a lot of public input, vigorous, adamant public input, sometimes empowerment. Right. But not always empowerment, but always input, always strong input where the public has an ability to influence and educate and provide wisdom for the outcome. And you know, I'm always careful to differentiate communication from real engagement to empowerment and all the stages of Arnstein's ladder and such. But what I've often been finding I'm doing with cities is they're asking me for advice on how to improve public engagement when they're doing a plan or a project. And I often say, well, if you're trying to have an intelligent conversation at that stage, it's too late. Yep. Because the people who often come out are concerned about change, etc. What you need is a quality overall civic discourse, a constant civic discourse about the future of the city that you can connect those smaller conversations to. And that's why WOOF is so powerful. The fact that we're live streaming this across the city, the quality of this level of discourse about the future of the city is the real public engagement. And then you have all of the kinds of discussions about specific plans or projects, etc., that sort of build on the kind of conversation we're constantly having, talking to the media. We've done so much media work over the last few days because the media is our friend in terms of helping us communicate a message and learn. Frankly, if it's interesting to the media, it's probably interesting to the politicians in the community, because the media spends all their time trying to figure out what the community cares about.
And this is what people really care about. We sometimes get wonky in our field at forums like this. Smart cities, resilient cities, technology cities, innovative cities, entrepreneurial cities, sustainable cities. But you go out and talk to real people. You go talk to my kids that I teach. Talk to people. All people want to talk about is their neighborhood and their city and why they love it or what's wrong with it. We are wired to want to be engaged in our community. And we have all these forums, you know, we have advice columns for relationships and how to pick the right person to date and career advice and how to write your resume. We don't have anything. And one of the big objectives in life with The Atlantic was to create a forum, a media forum. The reason people get mad at public forums is because, you know, that they felt they were not engaged. That's where the anger comes from. It's not people who are engaged already. It's people who say, oh my God, you're just telling me that now? But I want to say one other thing, which is not so much the problem of Medellin, but is the problem of some of the advanced cities. London, San Francisco, New York. This NIMBY thing, the not in my backyard syndrome. I don't want the public transport here because it brings a certain kind of person. I don't want the health clinic there. I don't want a tower next to me because it shades my building. I really believe this NIMBY thing is almost the Ludditism of the Luddites who smash the machines. This NIMBY thing we have to come to grips with, because building better cities is not just about my backyard. It's about the city itself, and maybe we see it in Canada too much. But this idea that you can slow down development, stop development, just because your little piece of the community in your mind is going to have an adverse. I think we're neighborhood residents, but we're also residents of the city. And engaging in that way to build a stronger neighborhood and a stronger city is really, really important.
Well, this is why you have to be careful in some cases with the word empowerment, because the truth is I like NIMBY. NIMBY educates me on what people are afraid of. because people are one of the greatest things, studies have shown, the greatest things people are afraid of is change. And the longer that something has been the way that it is, the more convinced people are that that is the right way for it to be. So change is always going to be tough. And there will always be NIMBYs who say, not in my backyard, and here's why. And I listen carefully. And I learn from that if I can delve down and figuring out what people are really afraid of. The problem with NIMBYs, in my opinion, are not the NIMBYs, they're the politicians who say no to a project because of the NIMBYs. NIMBYs, it shouldn't be black or white. And if the politician, 5 people show up, and in some cases in North America, and politicians say no and turn something down.
But it is very clear that a large part of what is creating inequity in our cities is this idea that I have my neighborhood, I've colonized my neighborhood, it has a lovely character, and I'm going to stop denser development. Yeah. I'm going to stop the transit link that's going to bring more people. And in this sense, it can be very hurtful. We need a dialogue about cities that shows how many of these things are critically important to improve the quality of life and the economic vibrancy.
Well, this is why the community conversation is so important, because you learn from everyone. But then it's my job as a city builder and a city planner to weigh that against everything else I know, every other audience I'm hearing, and I'm also thinking about future generations that don't even exist yet. And I'm balancing all those kinds of things. And so NIMBY helps my consideration, but it's not the end of the conversation, which it seems to be, particularly in the United States.
Absolutely. So let me try another idea on you. When I was a student of manufacturing operations, there was a fellow who wrote in the Harvard Business Review and contrasted great companies with awful companies. And he said the awful company was the one where the top executive and the top management wanted to micromanage all decisions. They knew better than everyone, and they tried to do everything. The great companies empowered the workers to do everything while the top management set a vision. So let's play this out for a city. It's the neighborhoods and the people who know how to execute, who know how to engage, who have the solutions, the simple, smart solutions. They know how to improve their neighborhood. The job of the planner or the mayor or the leader has to be to set that very broad vision of where we've got to get to, and then allow a lot of different solutions in light of that vision, perhaps not in contrast with that vision. I think that's a very different view of planning and setting the tone of a city than our traditional. I mean, I'm an urban planner by training and by PhD, than our traditional notion of urban planning. And I think we're all involved in that strip, but it means empowering neighborhoods, empowering citizens, and all of us setting a broad vision of what a city can be.
But when we talk about engagement, I think the key thing is to make sure that people have a strong sense of what they can influence, and you really have to be honest about that. If you've already made up your mind, and you're not honest about that, nothing drives the community crazier than that, and rightfully so. You need to be transparent in how you made your decisions and how the community wisdom that you gleaned has influenced that decision or didn't, and if it didn't, why not? So you have to show your math, as I like to put it. My 4th grade math teacher always told me, you have to show your work, or else I don't trust that you had the right answer at the bottom of your mathematics equation. We have to show our work. We have to prove we were listening and hearing and understanding, and in some cases empowering, in some cases not. But at the end of the day, if the leaders have made a decision because of their vision or what have you, then you have to do a fantastic job of communicating that and sometimes convincing the public that you're right. And that's sometimes leadership. It's sometimes the opposite of community empowerment in some cases.
And it's interesting because, in fact, we've been talking about one unit, the city or the metropolitan area, Medellin, Barcelona, New York, whatever. But in fact, that's an outmoded unit. The real units that are important in managing this complexity that we have to deal with, it's not one mayor or one planning director. It's the mega region. It's not Shanghai versus Beijing. It's Shanghai and Beijing. It's not Mumbai versus Bangalore. It's the economic entity of Bangalore and Mumbai. It's the area of New York, Boston, and Washington, Barcelona, across the France to Lyon. And creating that kind of cooperation, a shared vision, but also the neighborhood becomes so important. The city sits in the middle of the mega region, the big economic territory, and the neighborhood on which solutions can be crafted. So creating that mechanism where there's not a single entity providing the path, but a multiplicity of inputs from the bottom up becomes so critical in this age.
One of the most important things, though, in the work that I'm doing with cities, They often ask me to help them with the details. I'm often interested in helping them with their culture, because I think the culture of a conversation and engagement is the starting point. And a lot of cities I'm working with, they just want to figure out how to check the box quicker. Yes, I engaged, check. They don't really believe that it will bring wisdom into their process and result in a better outcome. They're doing it because they have to, and they want to go through the motions. And I won't mention any names. But there are others, and Vancouver's method has been deeply believing that if the community is part of the planning for the city that they live in, that better outcomes come out of that. Better wisdom, better results come out of that. And that's deeply in our DNA. But I have to say, if anyone is watching online from Vancouver, the truth is, that conversation is at risk in Vancouver right now. We had a politician, one I respect actually, quite an intelligent politician, say in the context of a bike lane debate, his line was, we had community participation, it's called the election. In other words, when they were elected, they were going to go ahead and do everything. And I think he immediately regretted it, but it showed a problem with, for the first time in a long time in Vancouver, a problem with the culture. And frankly, there is a debate going on in Vancouver right now whether our culture has slipped. And I think we need to be honest about that. Once you build a culture of believing that engagement builds a better city, then you've got to maintain that culture over time and over years.
Muy bien. Yo quiero agradecerle en nombre de todos.
Very well. I would like to thank Richard Forget and Brent today for this extraordinary conversation. And I'm not going to add anything else, or else I would ruin the magic of this conversation. Thank you to all. Thank you very much.